the talk I'm going to give is about Towards Tesco, and that's actually the name of a report that I was asked to write by the Institute of Directors, and it was published in March. I wrote the report, they wrote the title. But basically what it does is it sums up, I was in the public sector a very long time, and for the last 30 years, which sounds terrible, I'd worked in procurement, creating procurement organisations, then running them, joint procurement organisations, collaborative organisations, and really getting a feel for what works, what doesn't, what works well and what doesn't work so well. And the report achieved quite a lot of publicity, interviews on radio programmes and things like that. And I was quite interested to note that Eric Pickles was quoting it in in a press release the other day from CLG. So so this is really what it's about, and it's actually about procurement, outsourcing and shared services as well. So let's move on. Towards Tesco really says public sector procurement is vast. A new integrated model for public sector procurement could deliver huge benefits, and I think we got a feel for that this morning from some of the comments that Dave Smith was making. On outsourcing and shared services, it's still a pretty chaotic and costly picture. If you actually take a helicopter view and see what's happening, it still looks a little bit like ants scurrying all around the place. We eventually get there, but a lot of energy is used up in trying to get there. There's huge potential remains, and the proposition, should we actually have a new outsourcing model for the public sector? What should go into the public sector? What should be in the private sector? What should be shared services and so on? And there's a proposition for the delivering of public services. So that's what the report covers. So let's go straight on to procurement. And what I tried to do is to hold up a mirror to public sector procurement. So what does it actually look like? How well is it being managed? And how can we do better? And does it actually matter anyway? Well, public sector procurement accounts for about £220 billion worth of spend, depending on how you manage it, how you decide what's in and what's out and so on. But that gives you a pretty good idea. Most of us can't imagine £220 billion, so that's £300,000 per adult and child in this country per year on average. And that ranges from the unemployed right up to the highly paid people. So there's an awful lot of money in this room being invested in public sector procurement each year. So I would suggest that we all got a vested interest in seeing that it's managed effectively. It's 1/3 of total UK public spending. It's 1/6 of UK gross domestic product. It's nearly 1% of global gross domestic product, and in some areas it's much more than 1% of global business. Its size makes it critical to the delivery of public services, and therefore its effective management is essential to actually reducing the public sector spending deficit and deliver government procurement policies. And if we actually don't do that, if we don't use procurement to do that, then in-house activities are going to have to take a much bigger hit. So it's really important that we tackle this. And for those of you in local government, I thought, well, let's think about local government. £42 billion, what does that mean? If that was just what the country spent on procurement, well, what the country spent, rather, on terms of public sector, private sector, personal expenditure, that was just our gross GDP, that would still put us in the top 25% of national GDPs. So public sector procurement is massive. And some of the features of public sector procurement, about 65% is non-central government and 50% is common categories, goods and services, depending on how you define the categories. Doesn't mean to say they're identical, but there are broad categories, and I think one could actually expand the definition and identify that probably we're near a 60 or 70% really is common categories. So if it was your money, would you manage it like it is being managed at the moment? Well, we heard Dave Smith talk about the DWP this morning, and the DWP really has got its act together and is doing very well. And £4 billion of spend is a lot of money, but it's still only 2% of public sector procurement spend. So at least one organisation is doing a really good job. And so we do have some major central government departments doing some good work. Some large specialist organisations as well. There's the Environment Agency, Highways Agency, buying roads and so on. Elements of the Ministry of Defence that I think are actually much better very often than they're given credit for, because they're really at the leading edge of technology very often. And the research councils, for example, they're buying a high-performance computer, maybe the top third or top fourth most powerful computer in the world, and they absolutely mind-boggling in complexity and power. Those are specialist organisations, and a lot of that we do pretty well. But NHS got a different model. It's outsourced a lot of its procurement. There are 40+ buying agencies. We've got the Office of Government Commerce and its category teams, several thousand small to medium procurement units, over 40,000 procurement points, and an absence of mandation. Now, that's changing, but nevertheless, by and large, it's true of the public sector. And what we've also got, though, on the plus side, is increasing collaboration and joint procurement. And the National Audit Office report that Keith's team produced recently was perhaps emphasising this and giving some really strong lessons in collaboration as well. So, how to make savings, or how public sector organisations create unnecessary costs for suppliers and themselves. I devoted a good chunk of the paper to this, although the paper itself is only about 7 or 8 pages. And I basically took it from a paper I wrote when I was in the Cabinet Office in 1984. So things hadn't changed that much. And in discipline, if we don't actually have discipline in procurement, then we're not actually going to be able to make use of our purchasing power. We're not going to have leverage. Different procedures, contract terms and conditions, cost a huge amount for the private sector. You imagine if you're a private sector organisation and every time you tender, you have to send the terms and conditions of contract off to lawyers in order to understand them. And I came across some T's and C's the other day for call-off arrangements of 100 pages. You know, the private sector can't manage that, particularly if they're different each time. And the complexity of tender procedures and so on, and multiplicity of tenders. What does the cheapest tender cost? The very, very simplest tender cost a private sector organisation. Well, I'll treat it as a rhetorical question. I worked out this is about £1,000. Very, very simple one for if fully costed for a private sector organisation. So, £1,000. If it's fortunate enough to win one tender in 3, then that's £3,000 for every tender that it wins. If it has a profit margin of 10%, then it needs to pick up about £30,000 worth of business just to pay for winning one tender in 3, as long as they're the very, very simplest tenders. And it's quite frankly not worth it for many private sector organisations. So if we complain about not engaging with SMEs, then that's one reason why we don't. But the biggest tenders cost millions of pounds, huge risk to the private sector. Multiplicity of tenders then, tenders for the same thing, many of them. And again, I think I was talking to David Shields of the Office of Government Commerce the other day, and he said, I think with Banner there are 18 purchasing agreements. I think that was for central government, because there are far more in the private sector, Banner being a stationary supplier. Why don't we actually pull them all together and try and get the best for everyone? And that incidentally would save stationary suppliers a lot of money in bidding, and we ought to get the benefit. Different specifications in Greater Manchester. I'm told still we have well over 100 specifications for tarmac. We need 7, because each council wants to have its own specification for tarmac. And we've got inconsistency of capability, expertise, processes. It's probably true that we have all the procurement expertise that we need in the public sector. Fantastic expertise, but it's all in different places, and it's available by and large only to the organisation in which it sits. So rationalisation could bring a lot of benefits there. So why Tesco? Well, if we're honest, if Tesco operated like the public sector did, and if its stores each did a lot of their own procurement and negotiations, if they did their own construction, responsible for their own construction contracts and refurbishing contracts, do any of us really think that Tesco would still be in business? So that's the question. And the public sector has a multi-Tesco-sized purchase spend. So if it's not satisfactory for a private sector organisation, why should it be satisfactory for the public sector? Well, the only reason I can think of is that we have to pay our taxes anyway, so we have to pay for the procurement, whereas with Tesco's we don't have to use it. So Tesco's has to be very much on the ball. So what's the cost of poor practice and missed opportunity? And you're just about to give me my 10-minute warning, Keith, I think. Well, these are from my own experience, not things that I've done, but for people working for me have done. So furniture, 30%. That's what one person did when I was head of contracts in the benefits agency in the mid-1990s. They took out 30% of cost. And it was the National Audit Office, actually, that said we got by far the best agreement in government.